Welcome back to the Mom Mentality Show. I'm Austin Chadwick. This is Chris Lucian, and today we have with us Paul Tevis. And to get us rolling, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a newly independent coach and facilitator. I run a small consulting firm called Vigamos Consulting. I work with technology leaders who want to work as effectively with people as they do with technology. Because I was a software engineer and engineering manager for a number of years, and I know I went through a lot of struggles when I discovered that my technical skills were not the only things I needed in order to help people actually work effectively together. And so I do a lot of work with people, both individually and with groups, to sort of figure out, okay, like how can we actually spend more of our time doing the technical work because we're actually effectively addressing the human concerns that are coming up, rather than getting caught on those and having to spend all of our time and frustrations and energy on those.
You mean I have to work with people too?
I know, it's weird. It's weird. It's almost like software is developed by humans.
Yes. This is not the vision I had when I started this.
Yeah, I remember my first computer science class. We had to work together in a team, and everything changed. I think that first project, I had to stay up all night the night before to...
And you decided you never wanted to work with other people again. You all, Well, and fundamentally what happens is like a lot of people have bad experiences, particularly in school, like with group projects. Because in a lot of cases, at least when I did my undergraduate work in computer science, we're not taught how to do those sorts of things effectively. Like working together is a skill, right? You actually need to develop that, and if you don't, it's going to go badly. But it's like when you have a bad experience with something, it's very easy to say all things are bad. Like, I had a bad meeting, therefore all meetings are bad. I had a bad manager, all managers are bad. Like, no. And I understand why people get in that spot. So that's what I do. I work with people to try and help build those skills, and work with groups to help collectively build those skills so that they can actually apply more of their energies overall to actually building great products.
All right, and I think that kicks us right into our first topic. So we had the good opportunity to spend time with you yesterday learning about different kinds of systems, and one of them was complex adaptive systems. So do you mind telling us introing that topic?
Sure. So we did a workshop yesterday about working with human systems, and I kind of gave 3 different lenses into that because the quote that I end up using all the time from the economist George Box, right, is the notion that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so when I'm working with groups, I tend to, and this is partly the way my brain works, I love models. I love like picking them up and trying them on and going, when I look at the world through this model, what do I see that I couldn't see before? And so one of the models we talked about is the idea of complex adaptive systems, where you have the way of thinking about it is that you have these semi-autonomous agents that interact in ways that influence their future interactions. They create patterns. And so we talked about, in particular, a model developed by Glenda Oyang at the Human Systems Dynamics Institute called Containers, Differences, and Exchanges, which is a way of analyzing what's going on in a system and then looking at ways that you might influence it. Because the whole point is you can't control these systems, right? And again, if we assume the model maps perfectly, right? There are people are making decisions, and then they're acting on those decisions. And those decisions are influenced by and influence things in the environment. So by making some nudges to things in the environment, you can change the sorts of decisions that people make or sorts of behaviors that pop up. You think, right? You do a lot of experimentation with this. So like what, in that workshop yesterday, I know you kind of really dug into it in some spots. Like what was really resonating about that piece with you?
Yeah, you want to start us?
It's early in the morning.
It is early in the
morning. I don't know.
Well, for me, at least, the model, like you said, no models are. What's the quote again? One more time.
All models are wrong, but some are useful.
Some are useful.
The other way that sometimes people say it is the map is not the territory.
The map, exactly.
Right?
Yes. And one thing I noticed right away when learning about the model is there's a lot that is useful or correct about it, right? And so I think going from traditional development to a place where we went through an agile transformation, it went from very command and control to, oh, let's do this self-organization thing, right? And one of the biggest tough parts about that transition is I control people and tell them what to do, to more now it's like I give them more space. You loosen the constraints, I guess.
Yeah.
And you influence by changing, the boundaries, the
containers, differences, and exchanges.
Containers, differences, and exchanges, right?
Yeah.
And so
manipulating the constraints.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that was really good about all of that is this notion that essentially the 15% solution can come out of that, right? Is that there are all these levers that you can pull, and they'll have a lot of these downstream effects. And just anchoring everybody to that idea of you don't have to just go in and force the change on the thing. Instead, pull the available levers, run experiments on the system, with the experiment being in the context of like the Cynefin framework sort of manipulation of chaos or manipulation of
complexity.
Or poking at the complex system, I guess, is what the right thing is. And so, I really enjoyed that. And then I think I also, one of my favorite pieces of that was just the chain of effects, the diagram to chart back all of the different side effects of side effects of side effects, and then kind of say, okay, well, if I manipulate this thing over here, take me a few steps forward, and then I have this thing over here that changes, right?
Yeah, that finding factors and circle of causes.
Yeah, circle of causes.
Those are two really amazing tools that I learned from Esther Derby and Don Gray when I did their Coaching Beyond the Teams workshop a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And they're really useful.
We did that too.
Well, and you kind of recognize, after a while, that, and this is the thing that shows up in systems thinking, right? The idea that there is no root cause.
Yeah.
In systems, the systems are reinforcing themselves, right? There's the quote I shared yesterday where, your system is perfectly designed to give you the results it gets.
Absolutely.
And it means that everything that is happening is because of all the other things that are happening. And so circle of causes is about starting to identify what are some of those causal loops where it's like, you see this in organizations where it's like, oh, we have a giant bug backlog, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so we want to burn that down, and we've got this pressure we also need to spend time on building new features, right?
Yeah.
But so we don't choose to prioritize burning down the bug backlog, which means the bug backlog gets longer, right? Which means that there's more pressure to do this, and you actually see this cycle happen, and it's a reinforcing loop, as we kind of talked about. And so it's like, where can you recognize that those things are happening? Because there's no single cause.
Yeah.
And so starting to identify some of those, and then applying the techniques that we were talking about with complex adaptive systems to start to try and shift some of those patterns can be really useful.
That's really funny because I've always explained, I think, the zero bug kind of idea as a topic of lean, right? But this is also a really good way to concretely depict, and there are diagrams for complex adaptive systems. So you could diagram this out and present this as like, hey, this is essentially evidence that you're never going to get out of this bug cycle, and it's just going to get worse. And so,
also everything you're doing makes complete sense in the system that you're operating in, right? And that's one of the things that there was a conversation that happened during one of the breaks, which is always my favorite part of doing workshops. It's the person who comes up to you and says like, so I have this question about this thing. And sometimes it's something we're going to talk about later. Sometimes it's just like, no, that's the thing I really wanted to talk about, but totally out of scope for this exact workshop. But there was a question about like, do you ever get dispirited by the fact that like, systems, right? We're just Mongo only pawn in game of life, right? Sort of thing where it's like, it's important to recognize there's an element of it being impersonal in the sense that it allows blame to be kind of set to the side. Like it makes sense that you're doing what you're doing given the context that you're in. And when we can see what that is, then we can go, okay, we don't want to blame people for doing what they're doing. And also, how do we start to find ways to shift that? And the quote from Mary Beth O'Neill that I kind of ended the session
I was going to bring that up.
So she really takes a systems view on executive coaching, where when you're working with a senior leader who's trying to make these sorts of shifts in their organization, she's like, they have to understand that it isn't just these individuals doing stuff and you can change people and suddenly everything will be different. You have to learn how to work with systems. Yeah. And so she says, and there's this wonderful quote from her book, where it's long, so I'm not going to get it fully right, but the notion that the focus of study, of coming to understand what's going on is the system, but the focus of action is the individual. And that when we as individuals have the courage and the perseverance, basically, to then address systemic challenges, that's where change can actually start to happen. Getting into that whole notion of 15% solutions, where it's like, it can feel overwhelming, but recognizing that there are small nudges. Nudging is the way that I tend to think and talk a lot about with working with systems. Is we can try to nudge them in directions. And enough nudges, it actually, because system responses are almost always nonlinear, it turns out you don't have to have the giant master plan of exactly how things are going to go.
Absolutely.
But you have to keep nudging. It's a continuous process.
Yeah.
Nice. And the emotional part of that really resonated with me. It was something about like, you start to understand human systems and you become discouraged because it's just like, oh, it's all out of my control. There's nothing I can. You feel like there's nothing you can do.
Yeah.
But really, as you were saying, as an individual, you can pull the levers of the environment.
You can have an exponential effect on the environment.
Exactly.
Your effort, right?
Yeah,
right.
Once you see, and that's what things like finding factors, circle of causes are really useful for, is recognizing what are those high leverage points. Like there are going to be some things that when you're like, I'm going to try to nudge this, it's just like brick wall, right? The homeostatic forces in the system are just going to keep that in place. But that can help you find where's the spot where, oh, wait, this is actually a little less constrained, and it has these downstream effects that will actually start to roll a bit.
I think a really good example of that in our environment with mob programming specifically is that I see a lot of this stuff where it's like, hey, we need to be doing database continuous delivery. And it's just a technical concept. People complain about it, and I think database continuous delivery had been on the list of things to do for like a year. And it never made it into the system until one developer just said, I'm going to spend my learning session time learning this myself, and then I'm going to learn how to teach it, and then I'm going to start teaching it. And then by the time 4 people knew how to do it, then they were doing it, and then by the time one mob was doing it, the other mob started doing it, right? It was like, and so it was just the fact that this one person decided, hey, I'm going to learn this and learn how to teach it. Then that was kind of encompassed their effort in the space, and then all of a sudden you have 8 individual mobs all doing this practice that was on the list forever, and it was just that side effect of the side effect of the side effect, right?
So I'm curious, because that would not work in every environment.
Sure.
Right? One person deciding to, 1, spend their learning time, actually having learning time. 2, but it's like, so I'm curious, if you think about the things we talked about yesterday, what are the features of the environment that allowed that action to then be able to spread?
Yeah, well, I think the environment does have a lot of, I guess, protection from outside influences, right? Like it can things can grow naturally. There's no requirement to stay within a certain tech stack, and people have learning time. And people can learn individually or in groups, and so there's a lot of I guess freedom, self-organizing, things along those lines. That the team kind of has the privilege to operate with, but you're right. Like, there's definitely, if there is a regulating loop happening on any of this stuff, then you could reach homeostasis, right? Like very quickly.
Well, just to again, because this is the way my brain works, right? It's like I'm taking that CDE model that we talked about and sort of mapping it onto the things you're talking about and going, which of those are containers where you've got either loose or tight, right? So for example, the thing that you said about like people have the freedom to choose what to spend their learning time on.
Yes.
That's an example of a difference in that organization, where it's like, oh, cool. People can choose how they want to do this, so that we've actually increased differences. You've made those larger, as opposed to saying you have to be learning about these particular technologies that we're going to be using in the next 3 months, right? That would be a way of minimizing difference, of constricting it.
Yes.
And so there are things about the mob and the way that the mobbing system works that are different than a lot of organizations have been in, but that those are the features from a systemic level that allow that individual action to spread in a way that it wouldn't in other orgs that I've worked in. And so that's the thing that I'm always fascinated by. And when we talked about having me come down and do this workshop, I was just kind of going, well, this is going to be fascinating, because I'm going to get to apply this model to and have a sneak peek into an environment that is completely different from what I'm used to. And again, all models are wrong, but some are useful. It's descriptive for me. It allows me to go, oh, I see how that, it's different in this way that I can actually talk about that is relevant, with the containers, differences, and exchanges.
So that comparison, those comparisons can probably are interesting in and of themselves, because I guess with the all models are wrong sort of thing, you have to say, does it still apply when it's in a completely opposite environment potentially, right?
And it's does it describe how it's different, or does it just not make sense, right? And the thing that you were kind of saying, where you're like, I really like this because it maps more onto my experience. It helps make sense of these things. Models are always sense-making tools. Just that, and recognizing, right, the trap is that when reality and the predictions of the model disagree, right, don't stick with the model.
Well,
the map is not the territory.
The map is not the territory. I'll share one more thing. Maybe we'll switch topics. In that going from coaching in a non-mobbing environment to a mobbing environment, you see the difference. And I think, correct me if I'm getting it wrong, but I think the container, there's a big difference. So when you're solo programming, it's like you're a container unto yourselves, in a sense, right? Because that flow of work, the lines that you're typing into the code, is all just you. When you're in a mob, you're in a group of people and you're working on the code. To run an experiment on the system is super easy. Before, in a solo programming shop, you have to set up a meeting where you present a different way and you watch a video, or you do a kata where you try it out. If you're mobbing, all you do is say hey, let's try out this refactoring I just learned this morning in my learning time. You know what I mean? And all they have to do is be let's try it out. What's the worst that can happen? Boom, you're running because the container was looser, it's much more easier to influence.
So one of the thing that we talked about, that's one of the tricks with working with this, is that notion of, with containers and differences and exchanges, you can increase constraints or you can loosen constraints, or depending on which way you go, right? If you make the container stronger, that's more constrained. If you make the container weaker, it's less constrained. And there's no good or bad. There's the important thing is sort of recognizing, are we flailing? Because if we're flailing and not, accomplishing anything, then we probably want to increase some constraints. But if we can't get anything done because there's this, it's too rigid, right? We're all bound up. So, for example, what you're talking about, trying to run this experiment, right? You're just we can't get anything done because we have to go through all of these different steps, right? Now, sometimes you have to go through all these different steps because there's a lot of standardized process. Procurement is an example that I talk about a lot. And you're if we want to get stuff done faster there, we actually need to loosen constraints. But sometimes, if you want to get that stuff done faster, like in the situation you're talking about, we need to tighten constraints. We actually need to get everybody in the room regularly, all the time, to be able to do these things. And so there's no right or wrong, and sometimes you need to both simultaneously loosen one constraint and tighten another. But it's all just experiments, right? You try it, you see what happens. You predict what you think will happen, and then you see if that actually happens, and if it does, and if the result you actually want, then you do it. But
Well, speaking of increasing and loosening constraints, we're going to talk a little bit about liberating structures.
So it was actually really fun, because liberating structures, so for those who don't know, liberating structures, there are 12 different ways to explain this, but the way, my shorthand for it, which Keith and Henry, who created it, probably wouldn't agree with, which is fine. I treat liberating structures as a facilitation toolkit that distributes and increases participation. And there are, and again, going back to that notion that in human interactions, we are often either under-constrained or over-constrained. It uses a lot of the insights of working with complexity to restructure the way that we do interactions to actually enable enough brains to get onto the subject, which is about listening constraints, right? Let's get all the brains on there. But also providing enough guidance that people can actually get stuff done. And it's currently it's a toolkit of 33 different activities, structures. I've done about 20 of them. And I just did up in Santa Barbara where I live, I did a thing for the SB Agile meetup last week, actually, where we ran through 5 of them to kind of give people a taste of it.
Nice.
Cool,
yeah. And so, is it wrong to say it's like different types of formats and structures for a facilitated meeting? For those of you who haven't experienced something like this before, right?
Yeah.
So you come to a meeting, and instead of everyone just sitting around a conference table and talking randomly according to an agenda, it's a facilitator, kind of like a retrospective, but it uses very specific formats.
Yeah, so like
geared for larger groups is at least some of them I've noticed.
Yeah, well, so we did 3 or 4 of them yesterday. As part of the workshop, because I use them in my workshop a lot. So like the very first thing we started off with, and I do this a lot, is one called impromptu networking. So with impromptu networking, what you do is there are 1 or 2 questions that are given, and you get everybody to find a partner, and one person in the pair answers those 2 questions for their partner for a specific amount of time, and then you switch directions, and the other person answers those 2 questions.
Yes.
Same. And then you get a new partner, and you do the same thing, and you do 3 rounds of this. So you interact with 3 different people, but you're always answering the same 2 questions and hearing their answers from the same to the same 2 questions. So that is the structure. Yep. So the thing about it is it's completely scalable, right? Because it does not matter how many people there are in the room, just as long as you have a mostly even number. Yeah. But there are some versions of it where you can harvest some of that out afterwards. Yeah. But it's actually mostly just useful for, what I tend to use it for is grounding people into their learning goals when they come into the room. Yeah. So the question that I asked yesterday, and this is a very common one, is what are you hoping to get from this workshop, and what are you bringing to this workshop? Because when we gather, everybody's bringing something, right? Everybody has resources, experiences, frustration stories. Those are things that the group can draw on. But when you go to a workshop, how often are you asked, if you're not the facilitator, right? What are you bringing? How are you going to help? Right? And so we start with that. And that just, I find that because in the stuff that I do, I really believe that we are all responsible for learning, for each other's learning. And so by starting to, first you need to ground into, what do I want to get out of this? Because if you don't get what you want out of the workshop, that's on you. But it's also on everybody else, only if you know what it is and tell them, right? Hey, this is what I wanted. So I do that to sort of, and that's just a real simple example, right? And then we usually follow that with like a 1, 2, 4 all, which is the other one that most people have encountered, which is there's a question or invitation that's posed. You spend a minute thinking about it in silence. It's 1, just by yourself. Then you partner up and you talk with another person for 2 minutes and you share your answers, maybe brainstorm some new stuff. And then you get into a group of 4 and you spend 4 minutes. And then the all part is then you go around the room and you harvest out of each of those. So with that, what I asked, we sort of talked about the content from the impromptu networking, from 1, 2, 4 all, we talked about how do we want to be together? Like the question that I often ask is, what do you hope will and won't happen today? Because I find that's an easier on-ramp than asking, what are your hopes and your fears? But fundamentally, it's the same question, right? And then we harvest that out, right? And then I go, great. So this is how people are hoping the day goes. So now all of us can commit to creating an environment like this. So that's the first 30 minutes of the workshop, basically. And that sets the tone for everything. And what it does is, you'll like, what effect did you notice those 2 activities had on how the group interacted?
Absolutely.
I mean, what did you notice?
Well, so I like these exercises. It was funny because I think a lot of people on the team have been through some of these exercises and didn't realize it until, didn't realize they had a name.
Right. 25K crowdsourcing.
Everybody halfway through was like, oh.
You've done this before.
I think some of the main things was just the, like you said, the anchoring, like getting everybody kind of ready for the day. And then the fact that it wasn't just like going around to every single person and asking them about stuff. And so the scalability of it is one thing that I really like about liberating structures. But people came out of that, out of both of those initial exercises, essentially like primed, I guess. Yeah. And that's been, I think that's just a really good effect, because there are a lot of those types of things where you can just go in, kind of dreading the day or something along those lines. And so you got some people that are like, I have this stuff to work on. I don't have time for this, but I'm being required to be here. Stuff like that. Can be really painful, right?
I get, this is like the best worst compliment ever. I get a lot of, that was the best workshop I've ever been in. My expectations were really low.
Yeah.
But that's the reality that I work with. Doing this kind of stuff is they're coming in with that, and it's like, we're going to spend a day together. How can we all make sure we get as much value as we can out of this time?
Yeah.
And so that's a case where, going back to the complexity stuff, liberating structures are tools that allow me to create nudges in the environment to actually bring out the behaviors that are going to be useful for the group.
Yeah.
Rather than doing it where all the tables are set up classroom style and you're all going to listen to me and I'm going to show you things. And, if you just look at how liberating structures work through the lens of the stuff that we talked about with complex adaptive systems, it's like, oh, okay, I get it.
Yeah, one thing I noticed in the room was it really made collective ownership a reality. So that's part of the Agile Manifesto is self-organized, collective ownership, right? But how do you do that? And I feel like when you have a meeting or a collaboration event like this is one way to help encourage that, right? It's like, oh, this is what I want out of the training. That's what he or she wants. How can we make that happen? And as opposed to we're going to sit here and it's all on you as the facilitator or trainer to do everything. You know what I mean? It's like, and then that to me that leads to the Roman polling and Roman voting techniques you taught, where, well, how do you self-organize and decide without assigning one person as the team lead and he decides everything? He considers what everyone thinks and then he decides, right? Where with these type of techniques, you can draw from all the brains in the room and get the best ideas and decide collectively.
And what's interesting about that is that we're not used to doing that. And so there's a moment yesterday, which you may have noticed, which is where people started to go, wait, what's going on? I'm not comfortable with how this is working. Right?
I don't usually tell people what I've brought to this meeting,
and so it can be uncomfortable at first. And in fact, we talked a little bit about useful discomfort. Right? The notion that I also do a lot of work with groups on conflict. And we try to really distinguish between safety and comfort. Right, I want people to feel safe, but also they're going to need to feel uncomfortable, right? Because that's where change happens. Change is necessarily uncomfortable. Growth is a type of change. If you're comfortable, you're not learning and growing. But we often confuse the two, and so we go, "Oh, I'm uncomfortable, therefore I'm doing it wrong." And it's like, no, you're uncomfortable, but you're safe. Okay, I guess we're doing it right. And so working through some of those discomforts, and the notion of doing that that's the kind of thinking that we, again, going back to, we're not taught to do this stuff, in college, that we don't necessarily have a lot of experience doing it, and so it feels weird, and so we go, I don't want to try that. Until when you do it a couple of times and you see how the results change, right? And then people start to go, okay, and then and then it gets stressful, and then you go back to what you used to do, as one of my mentors once said, when we stress, we regress. We go back to our patterns and habits and things like that. But that's also a case where when you're working with a group that's made a commitment about this is how we're going to work, right? That can actually hold some of the new patterns in place more effectively. Which is kind of interesting to think about. I'm curious, when you talk about when you're mobbing, how do those new patterns take root? How often does the mob go back to the old way of doing things, right? Versus how often an individual might when they got stressed. And how much does the mob anchor them into the new way of working?
Yeah, well, I think that anybody joining in as an individual into a mob, a lot of times they will, it'll either be, just talking about Esther Derby and Don Gray, they talk a lot about the center, enter, turn concepts. Yeah. And so I think people that don't do that kind of immediately start maybe telling people like what they should do and how it should be different, things like that. The system, right, locks up kind of it basically wants to antibody that kind of behavior.
Absolutely.
And and then conversely, like if somebody is receptive and sticks around for a while, but then has opportunities for improvements that they bring up later in retrospectives and things along those lines, but have had a chance to kind of understand the current system, they have much more ease in changing direction. And so the patterns that I've seen pretty distinctly is either somebody who goes in and just starts trying to turn the whole thing right away, and then everybody being upset, or more commonly I see people being kind of receptive to the way of doing things, and then in that they start becoming effective very quickly, and then at that point they kind of give their opinions about where to go. So that's by far the more common pattern. But we've I've seen people not learn from it at all and blow up multiple mobs, and I've also seen people go in and kind of act as like a unifying factor wherever they go. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, one thing we were talking about in one of our table groups afterwards to kind of apply what we were learning from the workshop was the way, at least this table was making it practical reality, was like something that's been worked well for us is that usually in a mob a facilitator or two arises, right? And so if you have a conflict of opinion, is one to, we were talking about first empathize, like understand, okay, they want to do it differently for this reason, let's hear them out, you know what I mean? And then we'll hear both sides, and then we'll basically run experiments, you know what I mean, and say like, okay, you want to do it this way, you want to do it this way, let's either do both and then compare, or we'll do this feature this way and the next feature this way, and then we'll make a working agreement, and then that's kind of like the constraint to hold on to it long enough for everyone to try it, so work through the discomfort to see the result of it, and then we can try the other way, work through the discomfort and see it, and then we can compare and analyze and then decide as a mob what to do.
And that's really awesome, like to be able to have that level of we don't know, I mean, we have strong feelings about this, but we don't know.
Yeah.
Right? And so let's actually figure it out.
Yeah. And so,
awesome.
That's kind of where we were going with it. But that doesn't always happen in mobs, but when it's gone well, that's what I've usually seen is something like that. So
very cool.
Okay, so I kind of want to move us along just on timing.
Sure.
And so I know that you've kind of recently become an independent coach. And so I just wanted to maybe ask you a little bit about what that's been like, and if you have any advice for other aspiring independent coaches.
Don't do it. So I'm closing in on my first full year of doing this. I went out on my own last December. But the first couple of months of that were really just kind of figuring out what the heck was I really trying to do? What do I want to do? Still doing a lot of that stuff. And part of the difficulty is there are so many things that I love doing. Yeah. And the thing that I find is that, and there's very common advice that is proving to be relatively true for this kind of work, which is that you need to have a specialty that tells people who you should be working with that they should be working with you. Right? You can do other stuff, but don't market yourself that way. So, for example, like the thing that I say is, I enable technical leaders to work as effectively with people as they do with technology. And then they go, oh, well, how do you do that? Right? Or they go, oh, I know someone who you should talk to. Right? Or like there's, and so fundamentally, I do a lot of different things, and they may even like, dirty little secret, I did a workshop recently about forecasting and estimation.
Oh no! We'll edit that part out. No,
but kidding. It was just kidding. And it was really funny. But because and that was a case where they reached out to me and they said, we're having these kinds of difficulties. We think this is the sort of thing that would be useful to us. And I was like, well, this is not normally the kind of thing that I do, but I can do this, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not marketing myself as doing that, but I'll pick those sorts of things up. So people are worried, oftentimes coaches, they're worried like, well, I need to be able to do everything, and I need, and whoever comes to me, I need to be able to say yes to stuff. And that's true, but it's becoming more and more obvious to me that people hire you because they know you are good at a thing.
Yeah.
And they need that thing.
Yeah.
And so you have to pick what your thing is and market yourself that way. And it's called
Nice.
niching, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So know what your niche is, position yourself around that niche. But if somebody else is like, so for example, there's an executive coach, Orishal, in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
And she says, I work with mid-level executives at Fortune 500 companies in Manhattan.
Yeah.
And she says, I don't want to get on going to go through a tunnel or to go to work, right?
Yeah.
Because she works face to face with executives, and that's her niche, and that's who she markets herself to. She has clients who fly to New York to work with her because they want a New York coach.
Yeah.
So that's part of her brand. It's not who she markets herself as.
Yeah.
But there are people who have found her, and she's like, cool, if you will come here to work with me, I will take you on as a client, but I'm not going to Michigan, right? Or whatever it is, right?
Absolutely.
And so part of this year has been figuring out, like, what is that for me?
Okay.
And I do a lot of those different things.
Yeah.
The other thing is that a lot of people say it really takes 3 to 5 years to get your independent practice really up and running.
Yeah.
And that seems pretty true.
Okay.
So one of the things to absolutely be aware of is, what is, in lean startup terms, right?
Yeah.
What does your runway look like?
Yeah.
Do you actually have, because I'm still doing, and this is the fun part, although it's the frustrating part too, applying all the things that I know about lean startup and lean software development and things like that to my own business.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, how can I run experiments?
Yeah.
I think that the product offering that's going to work really well is this.
Yeah.
How do I learn
right.
quickly from that?
You have your every part of the investment is ultimately results in your benefit or loss, right? So like this is like, if you really believe in these practices, it's kind of put your money where your mouth is.
It absolutely is, right?
That's really funny.
And so that's interesting. Like that's a fun challenge. The other thing is, for me, has just been figuring out what are the productivity structures that I need to put in place around my work to make sure that I'm.
Sure.
So how do I visualize my stuff, right?
Yeah.
What does my personal Kanban board for these sorts of things look like? Like, how do I do this stuff? And again, it's things that I know how to do.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been talking a little bit about Atul Gawande and the Checklist Manifesto, and which is really about the notion that most of the failures in human society now are not about not knowing what to do. It's about failing to apply what we do know.
Yeah.
And checklists are a really useful way of counteracting that. And so it's like, I have that all the time, where it's like, I know what I'm supposed to do. I know what the good practice is here, and I still don't do it.
Yeah.
So there's a struggle there around it. The fundamental struggle for any coach is client generation.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like, how do you find people?
Yeah.
And that's where, if you've got a good client base sort of starting out, and you've got that can be useful because it can extend your runway.
Yeah.
But you also need to know that don't get complacent with that, because those clients will go away. You're going to need new clients. You're going to always need to be.
Yeah.
And so getting that pipeline going.
Mm-hmm.
It's the challenge of running your own business is that you probably are the sort of person who likes to do the work.
Yeah.
But doesn't necessarily want to operate a business
Yeah.
to do the work. Those are like the business owner hat, right, and the content delivery hat, right, are very different. So it's like workshop yesterday. I love doing that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Those
yeah,
are the I love being
fun.
with people, helping that learning to happen, throwing stuff into the pot, and seeing people go, oh, cool.
Yeah.
But I get to do that 3 days a month.
Yeah.
Right, and the rest of the time is building that stuff out, which I also love.
Yeah.
But also just finding clients, doing the marketing, talking to people, and that's partly where it is in my business cycle. So Jerry Weinberg wrote a book years ago called Secrets of Consulting, which I read when I was flying up to Portland earlier this year, and I think he wrote it as a sort of therapy.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of it's about embracing the sometimes paradoxical nature of this kind of work.
Okay.
So he talks about, for example, that when you're brought in as a consultant, there are strong pressures within the organization to never admit that there is a problem.
Yeah.
But if there wasn't a problem, you wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
So rule 1 is there's always a problem.
Yeah.
Rule 2 is no matter how it appears, it's always a people problem.
Yeah.
And rule 3 is no matter what it looks like, people are trying their best.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody's trying to help.
Yeah.
And so, and those things are not obvious.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of keep those in mind. So anyway, it's a great book. But one of the things he talked about was the whole notion of you have to devote 1 day a week to marketing.
Yeah.
Right, to building your business, to
That makes
client
sense.
work and things like that. And it's just like that. Even when you get to the point where you're feeling pretty comfortable about it, you still need to be spending that time on it.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us, that's not necessarily our skill set, our comfort.
You'll just be learning it for the first time when you get into it, sort of.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's definitely been a challenge.
Yeah.
But for me, I live in that space of kind of embracing, okay, there are things that I don't know. There are things, I help people learn.
Yeah.
It's like Arlo Belshi years ago was saying, I remember talking to him, where he said, he was like, yeah, I feel like I have no, sense of style or fashion or whatever it is. And then he was like, this was years ago, right?
Shows up next year.
Yeah, because he says, wait, what I do is advanced techniques for helping people learn quickly. And a week later, it's like, this is the 7 different ways you can tie a tie.
Yeah.
Right? And he suddenly starts to apply all these things to himself. Transformed entirely. Went from Agile Jesus to... But...
I think I've only seen the post.
Arlo. You only know Arlo now.
Yeah.
But so... Yeah,
this was 7 years ago.
Yeah, taking this stuff and kind of going, okay, how do I... I help organizations and I help people to develop new skills and new mindsets and outside. And how do I do that for myself as well? Yeah. And so it's incredibly satisfying. At times it's also frustrating. I have all these things I need to do. And that aren't why I started doing this.
Yeah.
And aren't, fundamentally, the other thing is about impact. Right? It's like, going out on my own is a way that I know that I can have a much broader impact. I can know that I can act. Because fundamentally, I think the stuff that I do is about helping people work better together. Is also about improving people's lives. And I know that as I've learned more about this kind of stuff, it's made me a better person. Right. It's helped me show up in better ways in my personal relationships, in other organizations that I'm part of, and that's the sort of thing that I want to try to share with other people and to make possible. And so going out on my own means that I have a potential for a broader possible impact that way. Awesome. And so that's one of the things that really keeps me going. Nice. But it means that when I'm doing all the business side stuff, I'm just like, this is not impact. This is not impact. Okay. So it's a challenge.
It does end up being impact in the second order effect.
And long term, right? It's also where I'm at in that life cycle. And it's just, I know where that is. So it's a challenge. But the
impact is caused by doing the business right, which then can lead to the impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like doing budgets for you.
Yeah. That's possible. Yeah.
Well, and it's also just kind of recognizing the time scale. It's like, okay, cool. There's stuff that I'm doing now that 9 months from down the road are going to bear fruit. And
it's the complex adaptive system of a business.
You do the right stuff, and stuff comes out the other end. So you do the work.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
And thank you for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a ton of fun.
And so, do you want to kind of say the name of your consultancy again?
Yes. So, Vigemus Consulting. You can find me at vigemus.com. That's vigemus.com.
We'll put a link in the
yes.
as well.
It's Latin for "we thrive."
Awesome.
Which is clever, but not necessarily spellable.
Yeah.
So another marketing tip.
Small and spellable.
It is. I do have a 7-letter domain. So that's
there
nice.
You go. Yeah, that is good. Okay, so just kind of like I say every time we talk is make sure that if you know somebody that really could benefit from seeing this video, share it with them, like and subscribe, and thanks for being with us. Bye, everybody.
Bye.